Welcome, everyone, to our June 20th Teal Talk. We're so excited to have you here. I'm Mary Wheatley. I'm the CEO of the National Scleroderma Foundation. Today's Teal Talk will focus on what's happening in scleroderma research and why we should have hope for the future. And we have two wonderful speakers with us today. Dr. Carol Fagali Bostwick serves as vice chair of our board of directors and the chair of our research committee, and she's based at the Medical University of South Carolina. And then Dr. Cassie Torak serves as the chair of our Medical and Scientific Advisory Board, and she's based at the University of Pittsburgh. We're so delighted to have both of you here. And before we get started, I'll just remind everyone that these Teal Talks are really encouraged to spark community, spark hope, and share information. And we always just want to remind everyone we're not here to endorse any particular treatment, though we may talk about that. None of our programs are intended to endorse a specific treatment or trial. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And Dr. Fagali Bostwick, I would love to turn it over to you to share a little bit about yourself and what got you started in scleroderma research, and maybe even a kind of a snapshot of our research program at the foundation.
Sure, happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. Okay, let me start. First part of the question, I am a researcher. My research is on scleroderma. My lab is run out of the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina. And as Mary mentioned, I serve on the board of the National Scleroderma Foundation, have been doing so for a while. Got started in research as a graduate student. I joined the lab as a student of an amazing mentor, Dr. Laura Levy at Tulane University, who at the time worked on feline leukemia virus. And I had a personal interest in scleroderma and wanted to do research on it. And so she was very open-minded, allowed me to do the research that I was interested in. And that was facilitated by support from the person who was the chief of rheumatology there at the time, Dr. Dennis Bower, who supported the project and also provided financial support to buy the reagents and the supplies. And I've continued doing scleroderma research since. In terms of research at the National Scleroderma Foundation, our research, I'd say portfolio as a whole, has really grown over the past several years. Many of you may know that we do give out research grants. We have two types of major research grants. One is for new investigators, so more junior investigators who are getting started in the field of scleroderma, and another one is for established investigators or more senior investigators who may have a new direction of research that they want to pursue. And we have one deadline for those grants. It's September 15th of every year. So encourage your providers, the physician scientists that you see, to apply to our research program. We also have a newer program that we've had for the past few years. It's a student fellowship award. It's intended for students who are getting their PhD, so pre-doctoral students. They apply for the award in the spring. We give out several awards, very generous. And the goal of that is to encourage the next generation of researchers in the scleroderma field. So to ensure that there's a pipeline of new investigators in the field to support them and encourage them to stay in the scleroderma field. We also have another one of our newer programs that was sort of started during the pandemic out of necessity to bring the scleroderma community together, is the global webinars. So we organize these global webinars on a quarterly basis where we bring 2 to 3 speakers who are experts in the field who have brand new, very exciting, hot off the press research to share their research in these presentations. The global webinar started out with a way to connect the investigators. That was our goal, and all of us stay in touch with what research is happening out there, and ended up turning into this forum where we have usually 300 or more people registered, and our attendees are from more than 30 countries around the world. So it's been very exciting to see the growth in that program and how the National Scleroderma Foundation has brought the global community together in a forum. And then the last program we have is a mentoring program. So for our new investigators and those who apply for our research program, we noticed over the years that some of the new investigators don't stay in research because it's tough. The hours are long. Your position is dependent on being able to secure grant funding. You're on soft money most of the time. And so we wanted to create an opportunity for these new investigators to have support and a network that will help them. So we started these mentoring meetings where we bring the new investigators together with senior experts in the field. We talk about the new investigators' projects. If they need resources, we identify resource. If they need tips, if they need collaborators, if they need to find a source of samples for their research, whatever it is, we try and help them to make sure that they are set up to succeed in their research. And that mentoring program is also one of the sort of amazing activities that the National Scleroderma Foundation launched. And of course, all of these activities for the research program are managed by an amazing staff member of the foundation, Shanna Gianetta, who keeps all these moving in the right direction. I'll stop there unless there are questions.
Thank you. That's tremendously helpful and such a great overview of the breadth of programming at the foundation. I'd like to now turn it over to Dr. Catherine Torok to share a little bit of an introduction, if you can, and then what got you interested in scleroderma research and specifically in juvenile scleroderma research?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it's a small world, speaking of mentorship and things of that nature. So I'm a pediatric rheumatologist. I'm a little bit of a zebra. There's not many of us. I think there's 200 in the nation or so. And how I got interested in scleroderma in general is I've always been kind of a derma rheumatologist. I've always loved the skin as well as the systemic organ involvement. And I love pediatrics. I love what I do. So in my training years, I happened to be at an awesome institution, University of Pittsburgh, where I had the opportunity to get excellent mentorship from both the clinical side of things, Dr. Thomas Metzger, as well as the bench research side of things, which is Dr. Carol Fagali-Bostwick, who's on the call. So having that mentorship early in my career really helped launch where I am today, in which is 15 years later. I have a pretty robust research registry called the National Registry of Childhood Onset Scleroderma, started by Tom Metzger around 2002, and then I took it over around 2009 and built it up since then. So I see kiddos all across the nation get their clinical data, as well as some of their blood, et cetera, and skin, and kind of do research studies, both in the clinical outcome measures, quality of life, see what's affecting them or not affecting them, and also looking at the inflammatory biomarkers in their blood and seeing if we can help find potential treatments in the future that might help target active disease or different types of disease within scleroderma. So that's the beginning of my career. I was very fortunate to have excellent mentorship, and I'm still obviously good friends with Dr. Carol Fagali-Bostwick and Dr. Tom Metzger. I just saw him at a picnic. His granddaughter actually was in my clinic as a research assistant for a while. So scleroderma community is very close-knit. We all are working for the same thing, to help patients with scleroderma. So the research is just an extension of my passion and the clinical side. So I kind of wear multiple hats. I do a lot of clinic as well as research. So that's kind of how I got into it. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, and then had excellent mentorship, and then just worked hard to kind of build that initial momentum up, and obviously still collaborate with a bunch of folks within the scleroderma community. And it's wonderful. It's both a national and international community. In my world, it's both pediatric and adult. And through pediatric, I work a lot with CARA, the Childhood Arthritis and Rheumatology Research Alliance. And we have a specific scleroderma kind of work group, and it's headed by myself and Dr. Lee for the past 10 years. But we really encourage junior investigators. We have at least 4 parents that attend our monthly meetings, and with them we get input of okay, where's research going to go? How can we help the kids now and then in the future? And we've actually published with the parents as well, and some of the research findings, such as barriers to care with diagnosis and initial treatment of juvenile localized and systemic scleroderma. So that's kind of what got me into it and what keeps me going. And we'll probably talk about it later, but there's some newer findings that have resulted from some of the research with my collaborators that's really exciting, that just kind of keeps me in the field, keeps me charged up. And obviously seeing the patients at the conference and et cetera, and seeing them kind of doing better over time. And now that I've been doing this for 15 years, a lot of my patients are like in their 20s. So it's nice to see those kids that were 8 or 9 when I started treating them, and now they're kind of in the college years. So that's kind of my passion that I have for scleroderma.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And maybe I'm going to bring Dr. Fagali Bostwick back up. And maybe you could speak a little bit. You talked a little bit about the research portfolio, but kind of bringing it back to kids as Dr. Torek was speaking. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the research that we've funded through that portfolio, or just how we try to attract applications for juvenile scleroderma. Oh, she's not able to unmute. Okay. So I'll share, and I'll post into the chat as well while we get that resolved, that we've made a big effort in recent years to really focus on funding for juvenile scleroderma research. And so we can talk about that a little bit later, as Dr. Torak alluded to. But as we work to resolve this muting issue, I'm going to ask Dr. Bernard Bostwick, when she can speak again, to speak a little bit about what some of the most significant challenges involved in research in scleroderma may be.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I was not able to unmute myself. I know where the button is. It wouldn't allow me. Maybe I won't mute anymore, and we'll just deal with the background noise from the hospital setting. I think some of the challenges in scleroderma research in general compared to other conditions is we still don't know the cause. We know it's not a purely inherited or genetic disease because familial cases are rare, and a study we did of twins with scleroderma showed that concordance for disease in the twins, concordance meaning twin pairs where both twins have scleroderma, those are rare as well. And so this suggests that it's not an inherited disease. Or not purely inherited. So the challenge in advancing research is we don't know this cause. Whereas for other conditions, for example, cystic fibrosis, they've made great progress in developing many different kinds of therapies for patients with cystic fibrosis, but that's because the mutation is known. And once they figured out what the mutation was, they were able to develop therapies that specifically target the mutation or overcome the effects of the mutation. So I think that's been the main challenge in research, is there's a lot of work going on to understand what's happening in the tissues, in the skin and the lung and the heart and the kidneys and the GI tract, but we're sort of operating in the dark when we don't know what the trigger is.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we're having similar issues with Dr. Torak. So while we work to address that, what I would love for Dr. Torak to think about answering is the same question. So, but thinking more in juvenile scleroderma and in the context of that research community, what some of the most significant challenges may be. And let me see if we're any closer to resolving that. So it doesn't look like it. I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Fagali Bostwick, and we talked. Oh, great. Yes.
All right. Okay. So the question was what challenges in juvenile scleroderma?
Yes.
What has been done just in general research wise with the foundation?
What challenges in general within the juvenile scleroderma research space do you think that the community is working to address?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's a rare disease, right? So it's rare in adults. So then in pediatrics, it's even more rare. So we have to work together. And that's why I mentioned organizations such as CARA, which works with the National Scleroderma Foundation, because what CARA is basically pediatric rheumatologists across North America. So both Canada and the United States at the different academic centers. And then those that are interested in scleroderma will kind of join our work group. And then we work together and perform different studies. Some are observational cohort studies. We have an ultrasound study going on right now to see if like ultrasound will help signify if the disease is active or inactive in the skin. Sorry. And then other international efforts just with other collaborators that we have as well. I have an ongoing study with the UK looking at genomics, et cetera. And that's like with us and the NIH. So, I think that's the way around some of the challenges, is that it's not a one-man stand. You definitely need collaborators from across the way. And in pediatrics, a little bit of a specific hurdle sometimes is just getting those blood samples and those skin samples. Depending on the age of the child, that can be a little traumatic. So try to kind of make that a little more user-friendly. And then to the families, the parents, try to help them understand like why a skin biopsy is important. One of my colleagues at the Adult University of Pittsburgh just went to the patient focus group and kind of said, hey, this is what we do with the skin samples, how we process, what we do, the genetic signatures, et cetera. So I think kind of getting a little bit more of that education out there will help. I know one of my patients, even though she's 19, she was terrified of the skin biopsy. And what really helped is, thank you to the National Scleroderma Foundation with Rick Silver, had a nice video of actually like doing the forearm biopsies that we do on a patient. And they were like, oh, that's all it is. It's not that big of a deal. So I would say that is one of the burden or hurdles, is just kind of getting more awareness of what is research and what's involved. And yes, even though there's a little bit of discomfort or unpleasantness with the skin biopsy, it kind of is worth pushing the field forward in my mind. So kind of getting that education out there and then engagement with the community.
Absolutely. Such a great point. We can definitely drop the link to that video in the chat as well. So Dr. Fagali-Bostwick, can you tell us about whether any of the funding that the foundation has provided through its research program has led to any significant findings, or what we may call even breakthroughs?
Well, if I were to summarize it in one sentence, we've had quite a few breakthroughs thanks to funding from the National Scleroderma Foundation. But let me start off first by making sure everybody realizes that the National Scleroderma Foundation historically has been the launching pad for the careers of the leading experts in the country. Those who are now leading experts, who are directors of scleroderma centers, who are leading clinical trials, who are mentoring the next generation of physicians and scientists. Many of them got the start of their careers through a grant from the National Scleroderma Foundation when it was known as the Scleroderma Foundation, Dr. Torek being one of them. But I was one of them as well. And so a lot of them have gone on to do amazing things. I'm sure you all are aware of much of the research done by their centers. But if I were to just focus on the last few years of grants funded by the National Scleroderma Foundation and the advances, they're advances not just in what we think of as research, but they're also advances that impact the care of patients. For example, we have an investigator who has developed this new MRI type of imaging to image lung fibrosis to spare patients the radiation exposure of CT scans, which is going to revolutionize how we look at lung fibrosis in patients. That's just one example. We have a researcher who is now implementing CAR T-cell therapy for scleroderma. I'm sure you've all heard about CAR T-cell therapy and the big hype around it. It's been mostly for cancer, but recent studies have shown it might be also useful in autoimmune diseases such as lupus. And so now there's a movement to work on that in scleroderma as well. We have two investigators who are looking at somatic mutations. So the genetic studies that have been done in scleroderma to date have shown that there's no single genetic mutation or gene that's altered in scleroderma that causes scleroderma. But historically, all these studies have been done on DNA that's extracted out of blood. And what we call germline mutations would show up there. But now there's evidence from actually 3 investigators funded by separate grants by the National Scleroderma Foundation, 2 working in pediatric scleroderma and 1 working in adult lung fibrosis related to scleroderma, have shown that there might be mutations that are called somatic mutations that are only detected in the affected tissues. So for example, in the skin or in the lung and in certain cell types. And that's sort of new leads we never had before into scleroderma that is happening because of funding from the National Scleroderma Foundation. We have better understanding of heart disease, which was understudied in scleroderma through some of the grants we have. We have new ways of developing drugs and administering them to make sure that the drugs are delivered to the tissues and the cell types where they are needed, specifically targeting those tissues, which automatically minimizes side effects and toxicity of the drugs. So we have grants that are using nanoparticles, for example, for targeted drug delivery. There are grants focusing on occupational therapy, physical therapy, and quality of life in patients with scleroderma, and how to improve knowledge of the disease to improve quality of life for the patients. I could keep going. I'm just talking about grants in the past 3 years, and there's a lot more I could cover, but those are just examples of just amazing research that is being done because of funding from the National Scleroderma Foundation.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, and very exciting, even as someone who's very involved, to just hear it all kind of at once. Dr. Tarek, you spoke a little bit about, the importance of juvenile scleroderma research and some of the exciting things that are going on and all the research you're involved in. Can you chat a little bit about how you kind of take the findings that are happening in scleroderma and use that to advance the way you actually treat and care for your scleroderma patients?
Sure, Mary. Yeah, we have a couple examples, and some are directly from funding from the National Scleroderma Foundation. One of them, we're still working on results, so I haven't made an actionable plan from them yet, but we are one of the centers that got the award for a somatic variant. We're looking in coupe de Sabre, or kind of linear scleroderma of the face, and looking at affected, unaffected tissue with Deepa Rajan as a new investigator in neurogenetics. So that's one of the exciting things that hopefully in a couple of years that we'll have a little more actionable item on that. But as far as other things, so on the clinical realm, the National Scleroderma Foundation has supported some of our meetings at the ACR, et cetera, of my colleague, Yvonne Folderberry in Germany. He hosts the Inceptions. It's basically a global cohort of juvenile onset scleroderma. And he has patients enrolled from all across, US, Europe, Asia, Australia, India, et cetera, and kind of putting that clinical data together to understand pediatric scleroderma a little bit better. What we unveiled was that kids were getting missed. Their interstitial lung disease was getting missed if you're only doing pulmonary function tests. And I even wrote textbook chapters 10 years ago saying pulmonary function test, a chest x-ray, but we said no CT because it had radiation unless the pulmonary function tests were abnormal or the child was having overt, pulmonary symptoms. But pulling the data, reviewing it internationally, we realized that was incorrect. All the kids actually do need a baseline high resolution chest CT to screen for interstitial lung disease. About 30% of them had normal pulmonary function tests, but we found interstitial lung disease on their chest CT, which totally changes their management. Then the medicines that we'd be prescribing is much different, and we'd also have different surveillance for those patients. So that is something that directly came from clinical research from an observational cohort, meaning the patients were just enrolled in our study, but they didn't have to have any intervention or even blood draw or anything. But that's the kind of power of getting those numbers in an international cohort. Another example that I could say was actionable is some of my research that, again, collaboration is the name of the game. I can't do this by myself. I collect DNA and do genetics with the NIH. I collaborate with them, the National Institutes of Health, Dan Kastner. He is a world-renowned geneticist and has uncovered some key genes in other autoinflammatory diseases, such as familial Mediterranean fever syndrome. So I've been collaborating with him for a number of years. We found a variant in one of my patients. He was actually at a talk in California, and one of the investigators found a similar variant, and they started talking, and they're like, hey, can we share data? Is that okay? And they did, and we found 3 or 4 patients that had the same variant in this gene called STAT4, and it's been published in the New England Journal of Medicine that these specific type of patients with localized scleroderma that's quite severe, like from the skin down to the bone, called pansclerotic morphia, it's very disforming and disfiguring, that they have these STAT4 variants. So what that means is in the pathway of the immune system, JAK and STAT are kind of near each other. So JAK kind of controls STAT, and there's JAK inhibitors, right? I think all of you have seen the Xeljanz commercials for rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera. So these patients were able to be treated with available therapies now that we knew that this was kind of in the line of their mutation or variant. And then how that helped is moving forward. I had a patient down from another state, and the physician called me and said, hey, this kid has pansclerotic morphia. I can't do the genetic testing right now, but what do you think? They're not responding to methotrexate and steroids. Should I do the JAK inhibitor? I said, go for it. And I saw the kiddo within a couple months, and the skin thickening and joint contractures were almost resolved, and my jaw was dropping. So that was a direct, and he was able to get the insurance to cover that because of our publication. Before that, you can't, it's still hard to get it covered, but this provider was very lucky. So those are kind of two real life examples. I have more, but those are two real life examples of how research and collaborating, and I want to say that again, collaborating, helped kind of move the field forward to an actionable plan that changed a patient's life.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And we're so grateful to all of our providers in our community that are such wonderful advocates for our people living with scleroderma that do this tremendous work to help get things covered and to share this type of information and to share kind of, this is how I was able to get this covered for my patient, is so incredible. Dr. Fagali-Bostwick, could you share with us a little bit about what you see as maybe the next big thing, or, you know, the future for scleroderma research?
I think there's a lot that's happening that's actually quite exciting. In terms of drug development, I've lost track of how many labs have potential therapies or drugs that are in preclinical testing. So preclinical testing refers to first testing them in the research lab on cells, in mice, things like that. There's a large number of such drugs being tested in different labs across the world. So we're hoping at least some of them pan out. But what's really also exciting is there are a lot of new and emerging technologies that give us a lot more power in doing research at a faster pace. For example, there are technologies now that, and we had technologies all along for the past several years that told you, for example, that let's say if you take lung tissues in lung, there are thousands and thousands of genes, and they would tell you, you know, these 900 are turned on more than normal, and these 500 are turned off. So you would look at them. But now the technology allow you to identify the thousands of genes in each individual cell in a tissue. So we are able to map out the gene changes in individual cells. And that has interestingly also led to the identification of new cell types that we had not thought about before, and new subtypes of cells that we didn't know about before. So these high throughput assays that tell you about genes, proteomics tells you about proteins, again, comparing thousands and thousands of proteins in scleroderma tissues versus controls, are generating big data, right? This is data that's hard to analyze just with the naked eye or one individual. So I think one of the exciting directions research is taking is in big data science and integrating results from all these emerging technologies to generate a clearer picture of what might be happening in scleroderma.
Incredible. Thank you so much for those insights. Dr. Torek, you shared a little bit about how research can impact clinical care and some of these wonderful collaborations. And Dr. Fagali-Bostwick is sharing about, you know, some of the latest developments. How do you stay up to date, Dr. Torek, with all of the developments that are going on so that you can provide the best care possible?
Yeah, a lot of it is going to the conferences, you know, just going to the American College of Rheumatology, that's in November. It's always a busy meeting, but you can definitely highlight and see what are the kind of topics that you're like, oh, I need to tweak up on that, or I need to learn the newest update. So I feel like that's where I get a lot of my kind of up and coming information, is attending those meetings. For the ILD friends, there's also like the American Thoracic Society meeting as well. For me in pediatric world, there's the CARA meeting, the Childhood Arthritis and Rheumatology annual meeting, as well as PRISM. It's a pediatric rheumatology update as well. And then a lot of us also go to European conferences as well. We learn a lot from them. EULAR just ended, that was just a week ago. And then PRESS, the Pediatric Rheumatology and European Society, is for the pediatric world. So that's where I kind of learn the most, because then you can go to the talks and you can actually talk to the people afterwards too and say, oh, you found this, like this is what we're working on too. And then my ongoing kind of monthly or every monthly calls with collaborators doing these different projects, because they'll run across something that I might not run across because they're a pulmonologist or a dermatologist and I'm a rheumatologist. So those are the main ways that I kind of keep up to date. And obviously the National Scleroderma Foundation, always has nice postings, and the webinar that Dr. Figali Bostwick was talking about, that's excellent, because that is like the cutting edge, what's new in scleroderma research. So that has been a great resource for folks as well.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Dr. Figali-Bostwick, how would you recommend people who've been diagnosed with scleroderma go about getting involved in research? What advice would you have for them if they're looking to do that?
Just do it. It's easy to participate in research, and there's different types of research. You can start out with research projects that maybe require completing a survey and information. That makes it easy. There are a lot of studies and registries that only require a blood sample. As Dr. Torek mentioned, if you're reluctant to do biopsies, watch the video. They're fairly straightforward with no complications. Just to give you an idea why it's important that you participate in research, a lot of the studies I talked about are done with blood samples or skin punch biopsies or lung tissues from patients who had lung transplant surgery. And, we get for research the discarded lung tissues. And that's how we've made all these discoveries. That's how research advances. We can't do it without you, because what we have found is mice are convenient maybe to use, but we are not mice. And often drugs that go to clinical trials and are tested in mice can fail in humans because humans don't respond like mice. So it's really important to be able to test things and learn things from human cells and human tissues. And the research goes far beyond what you give, in the sense that, for example, if you do a tiny punch biopsy, we take it into the lab, we grow the cells out of it. The cells divide in the lab and they continue to grow and grow and grow. And we get millions and millions of cells over time. But we also have ways of freezing the cells down in what we call liquid nitrogen cryopreservation. And we have ways of bringing them back to life and using them for future experiments as well. So the gift that you give of these samples is a gift that you give to researchers, not just the time you give them, but for years to come. They can be used for their research, their collaborators' research. And that's ultimately how we're going to be able to test the cure, is using the samples that you all give us to test first in the lab.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Torek, what advice would you give to emerging researchers who might be interested in starting a career in scleroderma research?
Similar to Carol's, just do it, like jump on in. It's a great community, as you kind of seen, like my mentors right here, Dr. Figali Bostwick. So just very supportive community. We work so closely with both the clinicians, the researchers, the patients themselves, and in my instance, the parents as well. And there's lots and lots of opportunities. So the National Scleroderma Foundation has been actually awesome about this. Lots of new things that Carol was mentioning. And I'm not sure if she mentioned it, but WINS is also another program, the Women in Scleroderma, specifically for kind of boosting women's careers in scleroderma research and clinical scleroderma studies as well. And this is led by Dr. Volkman, and she's really spearheaded it, and it's a great resource. You can just jump on in. You don't need to be a scleroderma expert. That's the whole point. It's like people earlier in their career. There's coaching and webinars, etc. I think Dr. Figali Bostwick mentioned that the early career investigator workshop that's paired with the conference typically for young investigators. And then she also established that pre-doctoral summer fellowship program for PhD folks that are interested in scleroderma to kind of get that first taste. And then on the MSAB side of things, we are actually in motion to see if we can help support clinical fellowships for adult and potentially pediatric, but more adult fellows in rheumatology program training, but to kind of specify for scleroderma. So we're working on ways to support the work field to kind of give them more opportunities to jump into scleroderma research. But I would say just kind of reach out to any of us that are kind of involved with the foundation. We've all been around for a little while and kind of work together, and we'll know, oh, you like interstitial lung disease, you should work with so and so. We can kind of hook you guys up. And then within pediatrics, within CARA, as I mentioned, like myself and Dr. Lee can help kind of steer you towards a specific study if you want to do quality of life, who to work with, etc. So jump on in. We're here.
Oh, that's amazing. I can't imagine two more supportive, wonderful people to have on today's webinar. I'm going to start in on some of the questions that we've gotten in the chat and some that we actually got ahead of the webinar as well, if that's all right. And Dr. Fagali-Bostwick, I'd love to start with you. We had a question about how the Foundation's research strategy or program might be unique compared to maybe other funding organizations in this space.
The research program at the Foundation unique in that the Foundation is the only one doing a global webinar. The Student Fellowship Award is unique to the National Scleroderma Foundation. The mentoring group, the mentoring program for the new investigators is unique to the Foundation. And our research program is very unique because we accept all applications that are submitted by the deadline, but we accept all applications submitted by the deadline, and then we put them through a very rigorous, unbiased NIH-style peer review to make sure they're reviewed by peers, by other researchers in the field, and to ensure that ultimately the grants that are funded are the grants with the highest scientific merit. So a lot of different ways that we do things that are modeled after the NIH that are a little bit unique to us.
Great, thank you for that. And Dr. Twerk, maybe you could take this one. Someone shared, it seems like trials are often focused on newly diagnosed patients. Are there efforts to do more research on treatment options for patients who've been living with scleroderma for more than 7 years?
Yeah, so I needed to prepare for that particular question. So I did look, and there are several studies. And so some of the studies were kind of for the early disease and sometimes early diffuse cutaneous, like they're very, very specific. Some of that had to do more with like stem cell transplant and some of the more aggressive therapies. But I actually was kind of looking through the clinical trials, and more recently, a lot of them are a little more loosey-goosey, and they basically say 18 years to older. I was looking, there's several that say till 70, 75. So they are expanding the age cutoff, which means like if you're 75, the average age of diagnosis for scleroderma is around 40s, 45. So a lot of those people would have scleroderma for potentially a long time. So they are not being excluded from those. Some of those include treatments for interstitial lung disease, skin disease that I'm looking at. They're like the phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. So there are at least 5 that I could search really quickly that were there that did not require kind of newly diagnosed, and up to age 75 for some of them.
Great. And then Dr. Twerk, I know you've spoken before as well about patients getting involved with their centers too, their local designated research and treatment centers, and how a lot of the academic studies will collect samples over a longer period of time. Could you elaborate a little bit on that as well in terms of submitting potentially tissue or blood?
Yeah, so I mean, it would still have to go through that particular academic center, but a lot of the academic centers will kind of collaborate with each other. So I have that National Registry of Childhood Onset Scleroderma repository, but they can be actively seeing another pediatric rheumatologist. They would just have to reach out to me or see me at some point in time to kind of get into the registry and kind of be willing to do the blood or the skin sample. So those opportunities are available. And then on the adult scleroderma side, on the National Scleroderma Foundation, it's we're updating the map, but it's there, all the different research centers, and we kind of highlight centers that are research. We're working on updating it a little bit more. If there's centers that are more kind of the clinical visit, kind of more limited to clinical visit, just so that there's at least a clinical expert in your area, but then kind of look for the ones that have more of that research designation. Those will be the ones that will most likely be conducting some of these studies.
Great, thank you so much. And we had a question in the chat about organ and body donation at death. And I've just suggested that probably is a great, it's very generous. And so thank you for suggesting that. a great connection point for a local center as well. And so if people want to reach out to us at info@scleroderma.org, we're happy to connect you. Barbara, I grabbed your email, so we'll follow up with you as well. Anything that either of you would want to add there?
No, I agree with Mary. It's important to coordinate with the nearest center to you because organs are donated for research purposes through a process called warm autopsy, which has to occur within a certain number of hours of death. And that's why it's important to coordinate in advance and have the documents and everything prepared in advance. It is a very, very generous and very thoughtful process and planning to do, though.
Thank you. Dr. Tarek, this is probably for you as well. We had a question submitted in advance about any insights on the effect of medications or treatments for people living with juvenile scleroderma, how that can affect growth or puberty. So this was particularly in, a 10, 11-year-old group.
Well, the good news is pretty much all of our medications, including the new ones, don't have an effect on growth, puberty, etc. The main one to be concerned about is steroids, and that's corticosteroids, meaning prednisone, IV Solu-Medrol, but that's across any condition, whether you're taking steroids for asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, or scleroderma, that those just cumulatively can have an effect. But that's typically if you're on kind of high dose for a long duration of time. And even if you are, kids are actually miraculously, and they can do what's called catch-up growth. So we just have to be vigilant, and we're pediatricians, so we're pretty good about this, but you just have to be vigilant of following their growth chart. So typically for scleroderma, either localized or systemic, our patients typically are not on the high dose long-term steroids. So usually it's not an issue, but that's the only one to really worry about. The other medications that we call DMARDs, or disease-modifying anti-rheumatic agents, like methotrexate or Cellcept, those should not impact puberty or growth. And the newer medicines, like the biologics, like Actemra, and other medications, should also not have an effect on bone growth or puberty.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Very encouraging. We've just gotten a question in, Dr. Fadali Boswick, about CAR T trials. And I know you spoke a little bit earlier about some of the work that we're funding in this area and how exciting some of the research has been coming out in this. Do you mind just giving some high-level thoughts on kind of the promise of this therapy for those living with scleroderma?
Dr. Torek may be in a better position to do that, but as far as research aspect of it, I mean, it's a very promising strategy. It seems to have worked in lupus patients. It's exciting because it's not something new. It's been well tested in cancer and, broadly used in cancer. And so we know what we're getting into if it ends up being useful for patients with scleroderma. There's still some testing that has to happen. And then some of the research the National Scleroderma Foundation is doing will get at that. But I think it will be a quick transition. Like anytime you repurpose a therapy or a drug that's approved for another disease, and most of the time it's cancer because the field of cancer is ahead of everything else, it seems like the repurposing facilitates the faster transition to applying that therapy to scleroderma. I don't know if Dr. Torek wants to add more to that.
Yeah, I mean, Europe is a little ahead of us. So they're the ones that actually kicked this off in scleroderma. So it's kind of like a hot topic in general. Lupus was the first that was in the New England Journal of Medicine for, that young adult female that was able to kind of get off her medicines and have a kind of remission of her kidney disease. And since the lupus kind of kicked off, the other autoimmune disease, including scleroderma and dermatomyositis, and even vasculitis, have really jumped on that bandwagon. Europe has, I think, in the teens, total adult systemic scleroderma patients that have had CAR T. The longest one out, I think, is about 1 to 2 years. The others are kind of more 3 to 6 months. So we don't know the full long-term outcomes at this moment, but it does seem very promising. The kind of like the allure of CAR T, doing stem cell transplants on juvenile scleroderma, is that there is some conditioning as if a stem cell transplant. So that means kind of chemo, but it's less. It's like a less amount of that chemo that you get before kind of the reset of the immune system. And that's the goal of the CAR T. It's engineered T cells to kind of reset that immune system. It's the patient's own cells, but they're engineered and they're infused back in them. So that's kind of the kind of thing that looks alluring scientifically, is that it's kind of a modified version of a stem cell transplant, but without a lot of the side effects that would go with some of those medications for conditioning for a stem cell transplant. But as Dr. Pagali mentioned, that we don't know long term the outcome. So we're actively following the different drug companies are kind of working with the different institutions in adult scleroderma land, and they're starting to knock on my door as well. Pediatrics, they're, obviously they're a little bit guarded, making sure that all the FDA and things are regulatory. But we, as Dr. Pagali mentioned, Bostwick mentioned, that we do this in pediatric lymphoma all the time. So it's not like a totally different thing in our world. So it's getting there. I would say, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 centers that are actually open for this in scleroderma across the nation, but probably within a year or 2, there's going to be several more. And I'm sure the National Scleroderma Foundation will post them as they become active.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I did drop in the chat a link to our website where you can find a clinical trial, and we have a tool called CareBox that is really user-friendly and will help you you can browse every trial available right now in scleroderma, and there's more being added literally every week. And then you can also approach it from a screening standpoint. So you can put in your, how old you are, where you live, what your diagnosis is, and see only those you're eligible for as well. So it's a very user-friendly tool. I would encourage you to check it out. It's trial agnostic. So we take every trial in scleroderma, and we're actually broadening that to include pulmonary fibrosis and PAH and other conditions that we know are really prevalent among our community as well. We did have a question about as researchers involved in trials, recognizing that it can be a burden for people to participate. Have you had any conversations with trial sponsors or companies about providing support for the patients who participate in those studies? And I'll open that to either of you.
At least for the research projects that are done in different centers, there is compensation for the patients who participate, and usually that's considered compensation for time, for when they come in, let's say to do the biopsy, compensation for things such as parking to come in. The compensation is limited by the Institutional Review Board, the IRB that approves human subject research. They try and standardize it, but also there are limits that can be used, because the goal is to make sure that the money that is provided, or at least the sum, represents a compensation for time and not a coercion to participate in a study. So you have to walk this fine line between the two.
I agree with Carol. We would like to give participants more money, but we have to go with what the IRB tells us, because you don't want to look as if you're enticing the patient to do the research just for money. So there is that fine line. So we give as much as we can, and lollipops and all that stuff to my pediatric patients too. But yeah, but that's what we're kind of governed by. But most patients enjoy being part, to be honest, at least my studies, my observational studies, enjoy being part of it. And there's certain studies where you're bringing a couple patients in together, if they're focus groups about quality of life, so they actually enjoy kind of doing research together and kind of learning together. So it's all not all negative. There's positivity as well. I know that it's not super convenient, but a lot of patients enjoy it. My patients are doing the research study right now in ultrasound. They're like, that's cool. They're looking at the ultrasound on the machine and just thinking oh, that's neat that I can see my lesion and it looks different from the control lesion. So the patients are learning as well when they're doing these studies. And as far as drug trials, I'm not as savvy. It would probably be one of the adult scleroderma folks to talk, but obviously whenever we're negotiating with the drug companies, we do try to make the less burdensome on the patients. I'm a parent of 3 and I work, so I get it. It's not easy to drive into some of these clinical research studies, but so we'll try to make virtual options whenever that's possible with the drug companies, but our hands are tied to some degree because they have a certain standardized protocol that's across different centers. So there's only so much tweaking that you can do sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So my final question, and I'll put it out to both of you, and maybe Dr. Torek, you can start, and we'll end with Dr. Figali-Bostwick. How close do you think we are to a cure or curative therapies in scleroderma?
Getting there. I don't know, Carol, 10 years. Would that be fair?
I'd say it could be tomorrow. It could be in 5 years, could be in 10 years. It could be tomorrow. I mean, all it takes is one observation that gives you this wow moment and you realize that's it. We figured it out. That's how we're going to get there. So it's hard to put a time frame on it because I would say it would start as early as tomorrow.
And just in my small lifetime of doing research of 15 years, the landscape has totally changed. Totally changed. I mentored under Dr. Metzger, and I'd walk in and I'd be like, oh, we can maybe do this, but we don't do this until the lung disease. Like, so there's so much more preventative medicine out there. We just didn't know, like just the evaluations. Everybody is getting echo, CT, like there's way more push for evaluations across the board for organ system screening. So if you catch things earlier, you treat earlier, and we treat more aggressively. There's now two FDA approved medications that didn't exist before, nintedanib and Actemra. Those are just brand new FDA approved. There was no FDA approved medications for systemic sclerosis until the last 5 years. I mean, that's amazing. So there's one thing is a cure, but the other thing is a quality of life change. And I've seen it. I just gave grand rounds in Toronto, Canada, and I was showing pictures of localized scleroderma, some of the facial changes and limb changes. And I was like, we don't see this anymore because we all treat with methotrexate or Cellcept or steroids in the beginning, where people would just say, they'll grow out of it, it will go away. But that's not the case anymore. We know that you need to treat with immune medications. So the patients are having a much better quality of life, function, cosmetic function. And that's just in the past 10 to 15 years. So the cure is the pie in the sky, but don't forget, I mean, we made huge strides in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, it's totally a different landscape than it was when I was training. Do you agree, Carol? I mean, it's a totally different landscape.
It's a totally different world. Absolutely. And it's moving at a faster pace than ever before.
Absolutely. So I'll drop those in the chat for y'all. Thank you so much, Dr. Figali-Bostwick and Dr. Torek. I can't think of a better note to end on than that hope for the future. It's been so wonderful to spend time with you all and to have a little peek into the exciting research that you're both involved in. And we're so grateful to you for your leadership within the foundation as well, and everything that you're helping us to accomplish through our research programming and through our medical and scientific advisory board. So thank you all so much for joining. If there was a question that I missed or didn't get answered, please shoot us an email, info@scleroderma.org, and we are always happy to connect you and make sure we follow up on all of those things. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you at our next Teal Talk. Thanks so much, everyone.